Thanks. Hi. Yeah, I apologize for being late. Somehow we had it in the calendar for 7:30 or 7 or something, and then we had a lot of traffic. But anyway, no more excuses. Here I am. I've been at Findhorn for the last week at a conference there. Well, it wasn't billed as a conference. It was called the New Story Summit. And it was kind of set up as a conference. And my head is so full of new story, like after hearing it all week, that it's become like this annoying cliche, even though it's a concept that I use a lot. So I have, anyway, maybe I'll say what I mean by the new story, and then I'll talk a little bit about the conference, and then I'll talk about how that, in my mind, illuminates the whole Scottish independence thing that is definitely in the air here. And I can't, not talk about that a bit, despite knowing almost nothing about it. So, the new story. So I basically see our civilization right now going through a transition in our defining stories, our narratives, even you could say our mythology. Every culture has a mythology that answers the basic questions of life, like who are you? What's important in life? What is it to be a man? What is it to be a woman? What is it to be a human being as opposed to an animal? Why are we here? What's the proper relationship to nature? How does reality work? How do you create change? What's the purpose of human life? What's the purpose of our species? All of these questions have different answers in different cultures. And the answers that we've had define our society. So the basic answer that we've lived with increasingly, and I'm actually kind of oversimplifying this a bit, but for the sake of a good story, let's say that the answers that we've lived in civilization, and these answers have intensified through all of the stages of civilization, through agriculture and industry, the machine, and information technology. Basically, they say that who you are, what is a self? What is a human being? Well, who you are is a separate individual in a world of other, in an objective universe. What is a human being, or what's our species? Well, we're something special. We're something that started out as part of nature, but through science and technology has gradually risen above nature. We would once have said conquered nature, domesticated the wild. And this is a sign that our story is wearing thin, because these phrases don't trip so merrily off the tongue anymore. The conquest of the wild, for example, the conquest of nature. That used to be a good thing that everybody would wholeheartedly endorse. But now we're losing confidence in that ambition as we see the horrific results of our conquest of nature. But anyway, that was part of the mythology, and it's still with us today in a lot of subtle ways. The assumption that well-being will come through control of this unpredictable, kind of wild reality outside of ourselves that doesn't care about us. It's just a bunch of random forces out there that move these masses around, and a natural world driven by competition, each being seeking to maximize reproductive self-interest. And so we are winning this competition, and conquering this world outside of ourselves. That's another piece of the old story. And the story of self, so there's the story of the world, how the world works, there's the story of a self. You are also a being seeking to maximize self-interest. This is written into our economic thinking, into our biological thinking, that you are separate. And it certainly seems that way in modern society. It certainly seems that what happens to your neighbor, what happens to the person down the street or the person, to any person, doesn't really affect you if you don't know them. Maybe if they directly contribute to your life in some way, that affects you conditionally. But it seems, like we read every day things like the Brazilian rainforest in the Amazon, deforestation increased 25% this year over last year, and it doesn't seem to affect daily life in any way. The price of a hamburger doesn't go up because of that. The price of a cell phone doesn't go up. It seems to be happening somewhere else, to some other beings, and not to me. So we live in a society that makes it seem true that we are separate, and makes it seem true that not only is your well-being disconnected from mine, but it might even be contrary to mine. Because if you get the job, then I don't, if we're in competition with each other. And I'm not going to talk a whole lot about economics today, but one way that this, and I'm calling this the old story, even though there's another story that's much, much older than the old story. You could call it the ancient story. And when I speak of the new story, I'm speaking really of the new and ancient story. Or a new story, new in the context of a mass society that draws on ancient roots. So basically, all of our systems and institutions are built on this old story of separation, of control, of the conquest of nature, of rising above nature. And it infiltrates our thinking in subtle ways. For example, an evolved person, a conscious person, is someone who's not you might say that so and so, just does whatever she wants, naming therefore desire as a bad thing, and a developed person being someone who transcends that in some way and operates perhaps from the mind, or operates in a spiritual realm that's not material. Our society also validates professions that are separate from materiality. For a long time, the lowliest profession was the farmer, working in the dirt. And a craftsperson, maybe someone working in a factory, that might be slightly higher. And the engineer, higher than that. And at the top, maybe the scientist, somebody working in a realm of abstractions, or the financier, again working in a realm of abstractions, a realm of numbers. So this is another way that we validate. I mean, that's kind of the conquest of nature, that someday we will rise into some non-material realm, go up into space, enter the virtual world, maybe even create synthetic food, space colonies. We won't even need nature anymore. That was the ambition. And this whole story is falling apart, and everything built upon it is falling apart. For example, we're not working as well anymore. For example, the medical system or medical technology, which is based also on control and conquest. You kill the pathogen. You dictate hormone levels in the body. You cut out unnecessary parts. You improve upon nature. And that seemed to have worked really well for a while. But today, all of these new diseases are arising, against which the technologies of control have very little impact. Same thing in agriculture. I was just reading something about about how, the genetically engineered crops that make their own pesticides, how they're not working anymore, you know? So the solution is what? Engineer some crops that make even more pesticides, or dump more pesticides on the fields, or meet the failure of a technology of control with even more control. Sometimes people have this experience when they enter the medical treadmill, and each medicine creates new symptoms that are dealt with new medicines, and they end up having like 5 or 10 or 15 different prescriptions. Okay. I just stepped out of the car and I want to be careful that I'm not just going into my usual. Actually, I don't necessarily have a usual thing, but there are certain things that I say that I often talk about to kind of set a context, and I want to make sure that I'm not just like dropping in. If I could do that, then I could just make a video of myself and give the same speech everywhere. But that's not what we really need anymore. People ask me, why don't you just do stuff by Skype? You could reduce your carbon footprint that way. But I think that part of the old story is the idea that communication can be reduced to bits, and that everything important to be transmitted can be transmitted electronically. But maybe there are aspects of communication that cannot be quantified and turned into bits, or that we don't pay attention to in how we quantify and digitize things. And maybe that's the kind of communication that we need the most right now. Maybe we have enough information. This isn't the 1960s or 70s when most people weren't aware that there's a serious problem on this planet. And this isn't the 80s or the 90s when people weren't aware that there are solutions to these problems. Now we're in a state where the solutions are pretty widely known. People know about, it probably isn't news to you that you can design buildings that have zero heating and cooling requirements. It's probably not news to you that we can, it might be news to some of you, but probably not too big a shock that we could grow just as much food, if not more, using small-scale, slightly more labor-intensive organic methods. It's not probably a shock to you that we can regenerate damaged ecosystems without having to spend that much money at it if we only shifted our focus toward these things. The solutions are all out there. But we're not doing them. So I think something else is needed, and that's why I come in person to these things. The crisis in our stories, in our basic account of what's real, who we are and what's real, and how to change the world, means that we have to access something outside of what we've been brought up with, what we've been brought up to think is real, possible, practical, responsible. Another way to put it is that our salvation will be found in the margins. Marginalized cultures, marginalized sciences, marginalized parts of ourselves, marginalized species, and perhaps marginalized ways of knowing and ways of communicating. At this conference that I was at, an Aboriginal man from Australia spoke, and he had gone to his uncle's to learn traditional wisdom. He had been, schooled in modern schools and wanted to reconnect to his traditions, and thought that he was going to use this to change the world. So he goes out with his uncle into the bush, and they're sitting at the fire. And he says, "Okay, uncle, teach me." And the uncle says, "Just sit. Just sit. Wait." So he sits, waits. "Okay, now, has it been long enough? When are you going to tell me the wisdom? When are you going to tell me how to change things? Just sit." Gets fed up, leaves. But he comes back, and he comes back again. And after enough sitting and waiting, he begins to notice things that he'd never noticed before. Steeped in the old story theory of change, we think that would be a waste of time. I mean, there are urgent questions, urgent problems that we have to take action and solve right now. There's no time to sit. But what if all of our actions, our habits of action, our habits of response, our understanding of how the world works, what if that is all based in the same worldview that the problems come from? Audre Lorde, an American feminist thinker, said, "The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house." Perhaps the tools that come from urgency and efficiency and getting the maximum measurable outcome with the minimum input of time or money or something like that, maybe that's part of the problem. Where did that mindset come from? This mindset, this belief in the scarcity of time, maximizing efficiency, that came from the world of money, where you maximize return on investment. And the world of money is a world of scarcity, built into the money system by the way that money is created as interest-bearing debt, which is a talk I'm not going to give tonight. But that's just one of the systemic forms of scarcity that immerses us and conditions us to reenact and reinforce that world unconsciously in everything that we do, so that we find ourselves unable to change things. We find ourselves, after tremendous efforts, realizing that maybe we just made things worse, and we're wondering why they haven't gotten any better. And when we reach that point of that impasse, that point of burnout, that point of exhaustion, then we do what this Aborigine man did. Then we come to that, maybe we stop. And an opening happens then for something new. I call this moment of stop the space between stories, when the old story no longer works. For many people in this room, that's probably happened in various ways on a personal level. The story that says who you are, what's real, what's important, how to be human, how to live a life, what a life is, that story stops working. And you might even have a feeling of vertigo at that moment, this feeling of unknowing. Who am I? Why am I here? Maybe you were an effective person in your old story, in your old world, able to get things done. But now those formulas don't work anymore. They don't work to get the kind of things done that you want to have done now, because your values have changed, your goals have changed, your understanding of what's important and real has changed. Usually, this space between stories comes through a crisis of some sort. Comes through, at least for me, It's when the old story doesn't work anymore. It's when, for some people, maybe when you get sick, so you go to the doctor, to the GP. Is that what they call it here too? In Scotland, you go to the doctor and he says nothing's wrong with you. The tests show nothing's wrong with you. And you say, but why do I hurt everywhere? Well, I don't know. Here, how about Prozac? That might help. It's all in your head. And so you go to another one, and they all tell you the same thing. The tests show nothing. And then finally you go to one that says, actually, you do have a condition that has just been discovered. It's called fibromyalgia or something like that, some autoimmune disease. And we can't really do much about it, but we can suppress the symptoms a little bit. And so this basic story of medical technology, medical science is progressing and conquering one disease after another. And if you're sick, you go to the doctor and the doctor will fix you. Like that story breaks down. So that's one example. And it could happen through work, through relationship. I mean, in America, it's the story of, the American dream, where you study hard, you get good grades, you go to a good school, you build your resume, you do all this stuff, and you're supposed to get a reward. You're supposed to get, a house in the suburbs, and you're supposed to be happy. And your kids are supposed to be happy. And what happens when you follow all of those prescriptions, and instead you get unemployed, or you raise your kids according to everything you're told, and they're depressed, or they're suicidal, or they get addicted to drugs. You follow all the rules, and there's a breakdown. And so that happens on an individual level to more and more of us, as it also happens on the collective level. The same thing is happening. The same crisis that is unsolvable, as Einstein would have put it, from the level of thinking that we're operating at. The same crisis that makes us question who we are. How does change happen? What is a human being? Why are we here? What is our relationship to the other, to nature? That was 100 years ago, that was clear. Everybody in our society pretty much agreed on human destiny, the destiny of the human race. Look at the world fairs that were popular mid-century. It was all about technological utopia. One of the slogans was, "Science discovers." Can't remember, but it was this kind of triumphalist vision. I read a book I remember when I was a kid. So this was the 1970s, so the book was written maybe in the 50s, on the insect world. And it said, very likely by the year 2000, there will be no more insects. But that's not a problem. I mean, that's the way that things are going. That we'll have hydroponics, artificial pollination, something like that. It was just kind of taken for granted that we were going to move farther and farther away from nature, and that was not a problem. So that obviously, as the awareness of the ecological crisis hits us, and its inescapability hits us, that story is breaking down. And we just don't know anymore. We don't know what to do. That empty space between stories is what allows a new story to arise. An understanding that you couldn't have come to from where you were. That period of kind of chaos, of unknowing, of darkness, of uncertainty. I think that's necessary. That's a necessary part of the process. So you have growth followed by crisis, followed by breakdown, followed by the space between stories, followed by the birth of something new. And I've painted it in a very linear way. Obviously, it's a lot more complicated than that. And probably many of you in this room feel, maybe you have a certain stage of this process that feels very present for you in your life right now. But there may be some ways that you are in the new story, which I haven't really articulated yet, but you can probably feel the presence of this new story. Most people have kind of an intuitive understanding of what I'm talking about. So maybe in some parts of your life you are living with a felt awareness and really standing in the understanding that we are not separate. The understanding that, brother, if I were you, in the totality of your circumstances, I would do as you do, because we're really the same being deep down. Compassion might be a word for that, rather than hatred. And maybe in some parts of your life, you're still blindly and unconsciously following the patterns that you were programmed to follow growing up in this civilization. So it could be a mix of different things. Which brings me to two different things at once. And now I'm deciding which one to talk about first. One is going to be the Scottish independence issue. It's been like a week or more now. Are people sick and tired of that, actually? No, it's still pretty alive? Okay. All right, just want to make sure. I'm guessing that the majority of the people in this room voted yes for independence, but that there are probably some no as well. But I'm going to talk about a few things that unify the yeses and the nos, hidden things. And this is probably an overgeneralization, but it's the same thing that unifies the liberals and the conservatives in my country, the left and the right wing. It's the same thing that unifies the climate change deniers and the climate change scientists. It's the same thing that unifies the anti-abortion activists and the pro-choice activists. This thing that unifies them all is the belief that the people on the other side have their beliefs because they are morally or intellectually deficient. What's wrong with them? Don't they see? And so, you look at the comments sections of any website that represents a poll of opinion, and you'll see pretty much the same theme. They're wrong, we're right, and they're wrong because they're stupid or they're crazy. Look at the latest insanity coming from so-and-so. Look at the latest outrage. They're immoral, they're depraved, they're wicked in some way. There's some version of evil, some version of different from me. Really, that's the essence of it, different from me. Because you're basically saying that if I were that person, I wouldn't believe this. I would be more open-minded. I would be more rational. I would have a stronger moral compass. So both sides agree on that. What if both sides are wrong? So the question that I come to is, what kind of country do you want to have? If you have a country where people are still in this fundamental agreement about the otherness of their opponents, then even if you have independence, you're going to have the same kind of country that you live in now. What the vote reflects to me, I'm really an outsider here and didn't even get that interested in the issue, but I read a few headlines. I looked at a few websites, got a little taste of it, and saw just tremendous amount of vitriol and fear-mongering and divisiveness. And I thought that shows that there's some work to be done. Because whether you have independence or you're part of the UK, if the undercurrent of society is to step so easily into vilification of the other, of the opponent. If society, if a large percentage of society is so susceptible to fear-mongering and hate-provoking tactics, then it doesn't really matter if you're independent or not. It doesn't matter that much. That this is something to be seen. And I think that the vote revealed that a bit. If your view is that the no vote was largely a capitulation to fear, and I saw most of the fear-mongering tactics on the no side, and if that's your view, then you have to ask, if you want to win the next time, you have to ask, how can I create a society where people are less susceptible to fear? Where people are less attached to the status quo, to the comfort and familiarity of what is already known. And this applies even if you voted no, because the status quo on this planet is pushing us into destruction. At some point, we as a culture, as a civilization, are going to have to let go of some of the things that feel very safe and comfortable and familiar, and we're going to have to step into the unknown. We're going to have to step into this space between stories. Each crisis offers us an invitation into that space. Each crisis offers us a choice. Either we can cling more tightly to what isn't working, or we can finally let go and step into the unknown. And what allows us to take that step into the unknown? For me, it's when I feel a basic kind of love and safety and acceptance from people around me. So I think that the hate-based, the vitriolic, hateful commentary on both sides does the opposite. It creates even less safety, more fear, and will bring results, whether yes or no, that will reflect this fear. Our whole society, especially as an American, in the car we were talking about, one of the people driving us was talking about his, I think it was his first visit to the United States. It was post 9/11, and just like how much of a police state it was, and how fear-based, and that hasn't changed since then. I know what it's like to be in a society that is just immersed in fear. You can see it in American foreign policy, always looking, same thing that happens in these websites, always looking for a bad guy. That's our lens through which we see the world. Where's the bad guy? And when the Soviet Union fell apart, we had that moment of disorientation where we could have stepped into a different world, but instead, so conditioned we were to operate according to conquering evil that we've desperately looked for another bad guy. The first one was the drug lords, and they even made action films where the drug lords were this, threat to civilization, like these monsters, right? And then that wasn't quite enough to keep the military-industrial complex going. So then very soon after that, it became terrorism. And now we're back into familiar territory, the territory of conquering evil, which is deeply programmed in us. Most action movies have the same premise. There's the problem. The problem is a wicked person. Dr. No in James Bond, the evil lion in The Lion King, something like that. And the solution is the total defeat and humiliation and very often the death of that evil person. So you can see how American and, I'm embarrassed to say, also British foreign policy kind of replays that approach to the problem. But it's not just like, this is not a superficial delusion. It goes very, very deep. It comes from, that basic mind form comes from the conquest of nature. The concept of evil didn't even really originate until agriculture evolved. When instead of each being having its necessary gift to give toward the well-being of all, some beings became good and some became bad. The wolves became bad, and so they were exterminated. The weeds became bad, so we attempted to exterminate them. So here in Scotland, we can see the consequences of no more wolves. In the car, we were talking about that a bit. When there's no wolves, then the deer population expands, and the forests can't replenish themselves because the deer eat all the seedlings, all the little saplings, and so it turns out that the wolves are not evil, that they have that the elimination of the bad guy makes, they're not really a bad guy. They have a gift to give too. All beings have a gift to give. And so the elimination of the bad guy actually makes things worse. But this understanding is lost as society moves more and more toward a domination model. And this started with agriculture. And so in ancient societies, good was associated with the expansion of the domestic realm. And evil was chaos. Evil was the wild. And so the hero king was the one who, even Gilgamesh went out there and he cut down forests. The hero king, right? Am I screwing up my, yeah. Marie, who my colleague, support person, and what was your title now? Plate spinner and external hard drive. Yeah, she's a refugee from academia and did PhD work in archaeology. So I'm always very happy when this stuff that I kind of make up is validated by her and say, yes, actually, there's like an inscription, on a Mesopotamian gate that says something like that, right? So this mind form and this habit of action that I'm calling conquering evil has a very, very deep root. And a shift in that portends a shift in everything else that comes from that root. We can see, and here's the master's tools again, we can see that our efforts to conquer evil just bring more of the same. You might overcome your enemy, but somebody else will step into the role of enemy. You might exterminate the weeds with Roundup, but very soon you get Roundup-resistant weeds coming in. You might take down the dictator, but very soon you get a new dictator. Martin Luther King said it, when you act from hate, you create more hate. And so this points at a different approach to changing the world that I might kind of summarize as the new story. So the new story starts with a very different premise. Instead of separate selves in a world of other, we see ourselves as interconnected, interdependent, interexistent beings. So no longer is your self-interest separate from mine, but you're a part of me. So anything that happens to you is happening to me. Anything that happens to the rainforest is happening to me. Anything that happens to the whales, anything that's happening to any part of this planet is happening to ourselves inescapably, no matter how hard we try to insulate ourselves from it, no matter how high a wall we try to build. And we are building very high walls. I mean, my country has pretty much a wall around the whole thing, not necessarily a literal wall, but you just try to get a visa, if you're not from somebody else within the wall that we call the West. But we can't keep it out. We can't insulate ourselves forever from the effects of what we do to the other. This is just a simple idea. Eastern religions would call it karma. It's inescapable. Western religions had the same understanding originally as well. So a new story interpretation of the golden rule in the Bible would say, it's not a rule not a rule that says, do unto the other as you would have them do unto you. But it's a statement of fact that says, as you do unto the other, so you are doing to yourself. So the new story answers the question, who am I, in a different way. It also answers the question, who are we, in a different way. No longer separate from nature, no longer here to conquer nature, but here to serve this larger being that includes ourselves. Understanding now that the health of nature is our health, that the sickness of nature is our sickness. Therefore, no longer treating nature as a bunch of resources that we can extract and make into products and make ourselves better and better off at the expense of nature. That's becoming, that ideology is becoming more and more difficult to maintain as the destruction becomes apparent. We've hidden from it for a long time. Most people, well, I don't know, maybe people in this room do know that, Scotland used to be covered with forests, but we've kind of hidden those kind of things successfully for a while, but it's getting harder and harder to hide them. And this invitation into the space between stories becomes stronger and stronger, and therefore into the space where we can embrace the new story of our interconnectedness, of our interbeingness, of our ecological nature. And this changes, so if you are indeed a separate self, and your health and well-being is separate from mine, then why should I ever do anything that serves the good of another being? I have to be kind of coerced into it or bribed into it. Because left to my own impulses, I will just act selfishly. So in order to be a good person, I have to conquer myself. And here is a mirror then of the conquest of nature. And so a lot of political tactics come from this. I'm not sure if I want to go there, though. Just want to make sure, yeah. Anything else about the new story? Yeah, one more part of the new story that I want to articulate before I maybe invite you into a conversation, and then we can do some Q&A, and a lot more can come out in the Q&A. I think I'll keep it dynamic like that. But one part of the old story that kind of enables the way we treat nature is to say that nature consists of basically a bunch of generic particles, a bunch of building blocks that are governed by mathematical laws, the forces of nature, that are just that are totally impersonal, and it's just a bunch of stuff out there. It doesn't have intelligence. It doesn't have the qualities of a self. If I believe that you don't have the qualities of a self, if I have an ideology, for example, that says you are subhuman, that you are of an inferior race, less intelligent, or that you don't even possess a soul, something like that, then it's very easy for me to treat you as such, to treat you as an object. Well, that's the theory that we have of nature as well. Like we say, yes, we accept now in this enlightened age that each human being, regardless of skin color, regardless of gender, regardless of ethnicity, has the full complement of the qualities of a self, has intelligence, has desires, can suffer, can feel joy. We accept that. Therefore, we need to treat each other that way. We accept that, but we don't believe that about, a rock. Like, why would I treat a rock as anything but just, a material? Why would we treat the earth as anything but a material? This planet as anything but, a whole bunch of biochemical froth on top of a rock, basically. It's just, our construction material. Because there's no beingness, no intelligence, no purpose, nothing that we're going to interfere with or spoil if we use it as just a resource. But most human beings who have lived on this planet didn't see a rock like that. They saw a rock as having some kind of consciousness, some kind of sentience, some kind of intelligence. The rocks are our grandfathers, they might say. Native Americans would say that. And they believed that all beings on this planet, not only people, not only animals, not only plants, but even forces of nature, wind, clouds, the sun, they believed all of these things had selfhood, selfness, and needed to be treated with respect. And that doesn't mean that you don't use rocks, but you understand that they, like you and like all beings, have a role and a gift to play. A role to play and a gift to give. And so technology becomes no longer an imposition of order onto a blank, chaotic substrate, but it becomes first listening to what wants to happen and serving that. So I'm not talking about discarding technology at all, but it's a different approach to technology. And I think that like intuitively, if you enter a childish state of mind, it's obvious that the rock in some way is alive, not by any biologist's definition, but a child would not think it absurd to say, what is it like to be a rock? A child would not find that absurd, and there's a part of ourselves probably right now that doesn't find it absurd. But the conventional view is that that's an anthropomorphic projection that the child makes. Just like the child, says that her baby doll is hungry or her baby doll is tired, and takes care of it. That's she's practicing to be a mother, she's projecting onto that doll, and she'll grow out of that and realize that it's actually just a bunch of plastic and cloth. That's all, right? That's a childish view. But we grow out of that. We grow out of that part that like can have a communication with a rock. Now, there's also a colonialist dimension to this, because guess what? The people that we call primitive all around the world also believe that you can have a conversation with animals, plants, soil, rocks, rivers, oceans, the sky, the sun, and the forest. They believe that too. But we've grown out of that, haven't we? We've grown out of such primitive superstition. Now we understand that the sun, it's just a ball of fusing hydrogen gas, and the wind is just air molecules bouncing around according to the laws of thermodynamic flow or whatever it is, right? We understand now. And we've got to get practical with that understanding. How do we know that our worldview, the worldview of industrial civilization, is so much better? Well, look at the wonders we've created compared to those primitive people. Look how powerful we've become. Look how successful we are. Look how happy we are. Look what utopia we've created on this planet. Look, So that story is breaking down. And I'm not, I'm always hesitant to say that indigenous people are happier than we are, lest I be accused of romanticizing the primitive. But this guy from Thailand at the conference was talking about his work in Burma, where it's very, very poor. And they would go into Burma and the people there suffered great physical privation, hardship, no food security, those really primitive living conditions. And he said, but everyone there is way happier than in the technological society he's from. And I think that, so for many reasons, not only the ecological crisis, but for many reasons, our confidence in the superiority of our story is breaking down. And the way is opening, and so I want to just quickly link this, and then I'm gonna move into another phase of our evening together, but I want to, this might seem to be quite unconnected. Okay, Charles, fine, that's a very nice philosophy. Yes, let's honor the indigenous worldview. Let's believe that rocks have sentience of some sort. Very nice, but okay, now put that aside. What does that have to do with climate change? It has everything to do with climate change, because our ecological crisis comes precisely because we see the world as just a bunch of stuff and not as something sacred. And we will discover over the next few generations that our solutions that come from the old story, engineering and controlling and efficiency maximizing mindset, will be insufficient and even counterproductive. And I see this happening now with climate change, where the problem is, okay, what's the problem? Well, it's high levels of CO2 gases. So what's the solution? Well, we got to bring this number down. And we can apply all of our tools of minimizing or maximizing a number. But when these tools are used without a reverence for the sacredness of nature and all beings, they bring contrary results. So, for example, you'll get huge dams in India and China and now lots of places. China has basically mapped every river on Earth that could support a dam and is investing in their own country and everywhere else and investing making investments to build these dams. And you say, well, each one of these dams could replace, 5 coal-fired power plants. So this is going to reduce CO2, right? But what happens when you actually build those dams? I mean, the numbers seem good, but what actually happens, besides flooding, whole ecosystems and villages where people have lived for thousands of years sustainably, well, not besides that, but what happens then is all those people move to cities and become consumers and producers, and you create more of a energy-dependent infrastructure, and so you end up building the coal-fired power plants anyway. Like, that's what happens. So it brings contrary results, because we are only measuring some things and not measuring all things. And it's impossible to measure all things. And so the solution of minimizing or maximizing a number, making decisions by the numbers, is insufficient to the task ahead of us. And that is going to be a learning, and a bitter learning, that we're just beginning to go through. So that's my prediction for the future. And I think I've covered a lot of different things. So what I'd like to do before we go into Q&A, I'd like to offer you just like an opportunity to get into a small dialogue with the person next to you or the person behind you. And I'd like you to just return, before we do that, let's spend a minute or two of silence, returning to that map of old story, space between stories, and new story. Feeling into what part of your life and what part of your being, what part of your profession maybe, is really in the new story. What part is stuck in the old story? How are you in the space between stories, the space of, I don't know who I am, that space of vertigo, of unknowing. In what ways are you in the state of growth, or of crisis, or of breakdown? Growth, crisis, breakdown, emptiness, emergence. I'll give you 2 minutes for that. And then when I signal you, take a few minutes to share with your partner which of these stages is most present for you right now. I'll give you a couple minutes. Thank you. So, let's start with a few, maybe 2, 3, 4 reflections on this little dialogue. If something, if you sense that it's something that really wants to be shared to everybody, or maybe if you think your partner said something really like moving and helpful, maybe you can kind of volunteer your partner. And let's have a few of those just to kind of process it. We have a roving mic here, so just signal the mic person, raise your hand, and yeah. Anybody? Yeah.
Welcome to Glasgow, by the way, Charles. It's
Thank you very much.
wonderful to be in a building that I used to work in as a social worker, and I just couldn't believe that you were coming A, to Glasgow, B, to Govan, and C, to the Pearce Institute. So it's a great privilege to welcome you. I'm speaking to you as a member of a global organisation called Grandmother Circle the Earth Foundation, and my title is Grandmother of the Burning Hearth. which means my door is always open, the cooker's always on, and I feed the world. And I joke, I kid you not. I mean, I live in Ibrox, up the road, and it was lovely to share this wee trio, one of whom is my grandson, and I have another grandson appeared somewhere. Where are you? There he is. And I have 7 more grandchildren, so I have a great vested interest in the future. I wasn't one of the 70% that voted for safety and security of my pension, by the way. On the contrary, I was very active in promoting, yes, not from a nationalist point of view, but having spent 10 years in Africa as a teacher, I was able to come back and have a perspective on my own society, which kind of shocked me and made me realise that we had lost an awful lot more than what we'd gained in our so-called technological civilization, etc. So it was very much part of that life experience that made me become a grandmother of the burning hearth, and recognising the whole indigenous voice and source of wisdom in the earth is not being listened to. One of the biggest threats I think that we as a society are facing now is the whole concept of fracking. And we have the indigenous voices both of Australia and New Zealand, not New Zealand, Canada, America, and some of the other places that are telling us that the basic things like water, air, and the earth on which we depend is very, very threatened by this get-rich-quick, and a few at the expense of the many benefiting from that. I'm also a student of Teilhard de Chardin, who 100 years ago recognised that we were entering into this new age called the noosphere, and foresaw a day when instant access to communication and being able to, maybe a Kalahari Bushman's walking around with his phone, what have you. We have access now to speak to each other and to access the information that only a few had in the past and used that as an excuse to rule us. So my question to you really is, how do we best use that now? How do we get this balance right between head and heart? Yes, we're very clever monkeys, and we've demonstrated that. But we've lost that access to that deeply wise spiritual side of who we are as a species as well. And as a grandmother of 9, I feel if we don't get that balance right very, very soon, we're doomed as a species. And I don't say that gloom, but just a recognition that we haven't been here for less than 5 minutes, actually, in the scheme of things. And it may be a good idea that we go quite soon, given the damage we're causing. So how do we get the balance right and use what we have now in order to motivate each other, to live together with each other, and to live simply that others may simply live? Thank you.
Well, obviously I can't offer a formula for that. But I think that the indigenous knowledge is available where it's always been available, which is in nature, in the stillness, in the silence, in the spaces in between. And we access that place often by being stopped, by surrendering, by giving up what isn't working, by realizing that our efforts of control that come at a higher and higher price aren't bringing the results, and even realizing that, keeping doing it until we're so exhausted that we just have to stop, or so fed up, or so sick that we just have to stop. But I don't offer that as a formula, because if I offered surrender as a formula, what we would get would be fake surrender. What we need is to be surrendered. And to stop thinking that whatever we want to create on this earth is something that will happen through our efforts. Our status is much more like a baby being born. You know, like like really the mother's doing most of the work. And yeah, it's a lot easier to bear a live child than a stillbirth. So the baby is having some role in it, mostly through its struggles, through the life force in it that's responding to the birthing process. I think our situation is a lot more like that. But that doesn't mean that that it's useless to articulate these things, because they feed into our being. And I find that when the futility of control and the dead end that we've reached is made visible, and the suffering is made visible, then we become people who more easily surrender. So there's a little bit of a paradox there. And I hope not too much of a paradox. I'll just offer that. Yeah. What I'd like to do is take, if there's 3 short questions, to take 3, and then I'll kind of weave together a response to all 3. So let's if you can make a question that fits into one sentence, and then follow it 1, 2, 3, and sometimes they almost become poetry. So try to fit your question into one sentence if you have one. Yeah, back there.
Thanks. I've just recently left uni, and I've had a few crises, as you say, that kick you out of the old story. And one of the ways I've been getting through it is realization of, once you create a good or a bad time, so to speak, you then leave a perfect space for the opposite to be there when the good time isn't happening anymore. And I was wondering how important you feel it is to have just a time as opposed to a positive and negative space. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's super important. And if your society is anything like mine, that time is not offered. If you go into too long a time of withdrawal, of grief, of exploring, of doing nothing, then there's something wrong with you. There's something wrong with you. There's no cultural space for that. Very different than many traditional societies, where you would have perhaps opportunity to go on a vision quest or a walkabout, and that would be validated as necessary. When I was, how old are you? 20? 22? Yeah. Yeah, throughout my teenage years and into my, still today actually, but I had this feeling of a wrongness in the world that I couldn't put my finger on. But I just knew it wasn't supposed to be like this. I remember it really strongly in school, feeling like I remember the last day of school one day in the summer, summer was beginning, summer vacation, and I got off the school bus and I was just so happy. I was like, I'm free, freedom. And like, I was like, then the part of me was like, why do I just get the summer to be free? Why do I have to accept the toil and drudgery and oppression and sitting at a desk in a row, looking outside at a beautiful day, doing columns of long division problems and memorizing trivia? I wasn't able to articulate it, but there was like this feeling of terrible injustice in me. And the realization, as I like to say, that we're not supposed to hate Monday. And that sense of wrongness in the world, I was lucky, actually, to have it validated in certain ways, because my father was politically very radical. So I got to read things that validated my sense that there's something wrong. I read Silent Spring by Rachel Carson about how DDT was killing the eagles and the hawks, and I read radical political books and stuff, and so that kind of validated it. But most people don't have so much validation, and if you rebel against what is wrong, then you're told the problem is you. So in my country, huge numbers of children who rebel are medicated. One way of rebelling is you refuse to pay attention. It's called attention deficit disorder. And so they give you, like, it's not a conscious refusal, but how do you make a kid pay attention to something that is not worth paying attention to? Well, we do it as adults too. You drink some coffee, right? That helps you focus on something you're not intrinsically interested in. But have you ever been so interested in something that you didn't need coffee because it draws your focus? Like, maybe life is supposed to be like that, So anyway, I could talk on and on and on about this, but and it's maybe indirectly related to what you were talking about, but I think, yes, it's related because it validates the withdrawal. To say, you were right, your secret knowledge that life is supposed to be more joyful and authentic and real and intimate than what's been offered to you as normal, that's true knowledge. You were right. That lonely knowledge is true. Like that, once you get that, then you no longer question yourself. You no longer have that voice saying, oh, you're just being irresponsible. You're just being a youthful idealist. You're just being impractical, naive. You don't have that. That voice is much weaker if your feeling of a wrongness, that society is not supposed to be this way, is validated. And with that validation, then you can step back and say, hey, I'm not going to play this game. I'm not going to play the game of getting good grades and studying hard and getting a career and doing the practical thing. And maybe on the weekends I can go to a electronic music concert or a rave or something like that. Like you have that validation that says, yeah, I'm going to question everything. I'm going to explore. I'm going to visit. I don't know who I am. I don't know what to do. But I'm going to find it. And that becomes the most important thing. We're taught that the most important thing is to survive, to make a living. How are you going to make a living? Oh, you're good at art? Well, you can go into graphic design. You can go into advertising. How do you turn your gift toward the service of your security? That's what we're taught. Actually, what we should be taught is how to turn your gift toward the service of all. What is your gift? What do you care about? What is your gift and what calls your gift? What do you care about? That's what we need to learn. And that's what happens in that empty space. The cultures we call primitive understood this. And they would purposefully create empty spaces. They would create a breakdown in your identity, a coming-of-age ritual, a coming-of-age ordeal, not just a ritual, but a whole initiation. And we don't really have that offered in our society, so we piece one together as best we can by getting obliterated and things like that. Okay, thank you. I guess I didn't do the 3-question thing.
Yeah, hi there, thank you. Just while we were having our discussion here, I was re-triggered into something that's been with me for a long time. Around 25 years ago, I spent some time living on a leprosy project in a very remote part of Nepal. And you might as well have gone back 2,000 years in time. There were no modern aspects of that society. You had to walk for 8 days to get there. And I think what stayed with me was how grotesque observing leprosy was and seeing maggots eating people. And I think it really killed my sense of romanticism about nature. And actually, the people in the village weren't happy. They really didn't have so much in the way of creative activities, imagination that we have in our society. And I suppose it just... So I guess part of it is just I struggled from that time on with any sense of romanticisation of primitive or communities. But also, I suppose, a bigger question, one I'd maybe like to say more about, is about security, because it made me value security of the society and healthcare and things that I live in. But so many of our battles in the world seem to be about this concept of security. And I know at some sort of, I don't know, high Buddhist level or whatever, we have to let go of our lives, but also to be humans and to care and to love, we have to try to create those systems that do maintain our lives. And I'm just a bit confused, but I know that I struggle. I watched a lot of the conference from Findhorn on the live stream, and I enjoyed it very much. But I still felt there was something around how do we deal with this difficult reality of nature and life that is actually really quite unpleasant.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, I'm not someone who, rejects technology out of hand and says that, control and security and the effort to create a nest, for God's sake, is a wrong thing. Animals do it. I mean, all animals alter their environment in order to enhance their well-being. And human beings are the same. So there's nothing intrinsically wrong with that. And I'm also not saying that technological medicine has no place. I think that every culture has a medicine to offer every other culture, and so perhaps in the West we have ways of treating leprosy that are really useful and good. So, and we don't want to reject those on ideological grounds. And I've also been in places that are less developed, I've been in both. I've been in places where people seemed a lot happier, and I've been in places where people seem miserable. And I think, though, it's hard to have an objective understanding of it, because anywhere we go has already felt the impact of us. So many places on Earth that were once very undeveloped are now in the grips of the system of global capitalism, the conversion of their livelihoods into the production of commodities, the stripping of their communities and relationships. When you take away the foundations of a happy, thriving society, when you disrupt community structures of mutual care, of mutual aid, of reciprocity, of sharing, when you take away the skills, when you take away the natural resources, when you destroy a culture's foundations and leave them with nothing, then of course economic development is a positive step. So, I mean, I've had this. I was in South Africa recently, having this conversation and offering a critique of development, describing how economic growth often means a replacement of community functions with commoditized functions. So, for example, you instead of everybody knowing how to build a house, you have building codes and zoning laws and a construction industry, and that's economic growth. Instead of the village taking care of the kids, you have a daycare center and a school. Instead of everybody singing, you have a music industry, and so on and so forth. So each one of these things creates economic growth and strips away relationship and connectedness. When you take away traditional land rights and the commons and these kind of non-codified systems of land use, and you replace it with property and mortgages and commodity crops for export and monocultures, and people don't have their little fields and their plots and their gardens and their local culinary culture, and they need to purchase foodstuffs produced from the outside, and then the logic of capitalism drives down their wages, and the whole picture, right? When you do that, then of course they're going to want to have jobs and to develop, and they're going to be miserable. So I guess it's just a matter of context, and it's a hard question to answer. I mean, this is, I don't think any of us in this room would be able to resolve this debate. I mean, it's in anthropology, this fierce, very personal, angry debate about essentially, was primitive life better or worse than it is today? And each side marshals very convincing arguments with lots of evidence. I tend to find myself agreeing with whatever side I'm reading at the time, but obviously my sympathies tend toward the ones that think that primitive life was in general happier. But yeah, so I hope that covers some of the bases. Yeah.
Hi. First of all, I'd just like to know what you do in your day-to-day lives, having a minimal impact on the environment, Charles.
Can you say it again? That's Scottish.
Sorry, your minimal impact on minimal impact on the environment day to day. What you do, being can I call you a free economist?
A free what?
A free economist, as in a gift economy.
Free economist. Okay, right.
And I'd also like to say the gift economy, there is a project in North Wales by my friend Frank that was set up many years ago. It's the Well Health Being Community, and it's all off-grid, and I feel it represents what kind of all that you've been talking about tonight. So I'm just interested in sort of seeing if you can offer a solution, because as an environmentalist campaigner for now over 20 years, starting from Twyford down, where I cut my teeth environmentally with the Dongas tribe, which was the start of environmental activism in the UK. And so I really think we need solutions in this day and age. Thanks.
Yeah. So did I hear the first part of the question was something about my personal? Yeah. Geez, I have a huge carbon footprint. I fly a lot. Doing my work. I don't make my choices based on what will reduce my carbon footprint. I make my choices based on what calls me into service to what I care about. And I think that if everybody made their choices based on that, we'd have a lot less travel. We'd still have some, but we'd have a lot less travel, because most of the reasons people travel are a substitute. Either if it's leisure travel, it's a substitute for what's missing in their lives. If it's business travel, it's not because they truly love to go to the marketing conference or whatever it is, but it's their job. So that's one, I have a lot more about that in my book, because I get asked that sometimes. And as for solutions, I mean, did you read Sacred Economics at all? Well, so the book I wrote a few years ago was basically tackling that question on several levels, because I think a lot of a lot of the problem lies in our money system. We have a money system that only works if there's economic growth. When economic growth stagnates, then lending opportunities dry up, and we saw what happened in 2008. That's a somewhat complicated argument I don't want to go into now, but basically simply put, when money is created through lending at interest, then there's always more debt than there is money. The only way that the debt can be repaid is if even more money is created. More money comes with even more debt. And that gets paid when even more money is created. How does the money get created? Well, I will lend to somebody who has a good business plan. I will lend to somebody who's going to create new goods and services, who says, Charles, there's still a forest standing. I could cut that down and sell the lumber, and I will make that loan to you. Charles, we can institute fracking here, and we can sell the gas. I will make that loan to you. But when there are no more forests left, and when the water is all polluted from fracking, and when there are no more daycare centers to be set up, because no one takes care of their kids anymore, and when there are no more fast food restaurants to be built because nobody cooks anymore, when there's no more room for growth, then I can no longer lend new money into existence because you won't be able to pay me back. So lending shrinks, and the debts become unpayable, and the pressure increases on everybody who owes money, and every company who owes money, and every government who owes money to find something to sell, to find some way to squeeze a little bit more growth out of this old planet. So we have this relentless pressure to monetize and commoditize everything. And as an environmentalist, you're fighting against the tide. So you have a victory here, a victory there amidst a tide of defeat. So that's, as far as solutions go, that's why I went to the money system, and what would a money system look like that didn't depend on growth for its functioning, that didn't destroy community, that didn't create artificial scarcity and artificial competition. And so I lay out, various things. Some of them would be familiar to you and some of them wouldn't be, but drawing on various threads. But I want to say one more thing. As far as solutions go, I also get kind of sick of the idea of solutions that depend on we doing something when I'm just me. Yet, what's offered for me to do is unsatisfying as well. It's like Al Gore telling you to, take shorter showers and change your light bulbs to something else. That you doing that one little thing isn't going to make much of a difference. I mean, so what do you do? That leads to something I'm just going to leave you with that right now, because I think a lot of people face that kind of futility. I'm just one person. What does it matter? Even if I polluted to my heart's content, what difference would it really make? If everybody else stops polluting, then my contribution to it wouldn't matter. If everybody else keeps polluting, then it doesn't matter if I stop, right? What does it matter what I do? We have various ways of escaping that logic, but it's kind of always there underneath. And where it leads me to is that we have to have a different reason to do things other than it will make a measurable difference. A different reason to do things. Same with voting. Your vote wouldn't have changed things if you had stayed home, if you had gone fishing instead. So why did you do it? There's another reason there. I'm just going to leave you with that. I might come back to it, but let's take another question. Yeah.
Hello. Just, I guess, developing on from there's one particular phrase in your book that stuck with me, what really kind of resonated with me at the time, and it does throughout, and it's that every single action has cosmic significance. And I'm just thinking about that in relation to how you ended that point there, and like what can we do in the face of all of these horrendous things that humanity has brought upon the world? We can't really do much, but it was that every single action has cosmic significance that just made me think, whoa, there's loads we can do as an individual, and then, growing consciousness and awareness and spreading that. And it's not solving the problems in a big way. It's like every single little action accumulating. And I just would really like to hear you talk a bit about that, if you wouldn't mind.
Okay, good. So that does follow where you were going there. So embedded in our, what I'm calling the old story, the story of separation, is a theory of change. The theory of change says that change happens when you exert a force on a mass, basically, in this Newtonian universe. So if you want to make a big change in this world, you have to muster a big force. You have to maybe have lots of money, because that will allow you to make people do things. It's a kind of an implementive force. Or maybe if you have a big platform, like me, I can do important things that actually create change in the world, because thousands or tens of thousands of people are going to listen to me, and their forces will add together to create a common action and have an effect. But, people who aren't well known, the humble people, you don't really matter that much. What you do isn't as significant. So notice how this is so disempowering to almost everybody, and how it invalidates the things that actually hold society together, and worse, it invalidates the things that are actually going to change the world if everybody does them. So it gets back to that paradox. So what other reason could you have? And what could validate the felt sense of significance when you are doing some small private act of service to somebody that you love, or to a stranger? We can feel that it's important to do those things. And if you've ever been in that situation, it could even be like a injured puppy or something like that, that you take home and take care of and spend a lot of time doing that. How do you reconcile the feeling that that's important? Or if you have an aging loved one, maybe a dying loved one, and you spend days and weeks and months at the bedside, and it feels really important, and maybe there's a moment of forgiveness in that process. And you wouldn't miss that for the world. Like, that's the most important thing in the world right now. You know it, you feel it. But the cynic would say, well, you're spending all that time with a person who's going to die anyway. What difference does that make? Notice how it invalidates most of the things that women do, and celebrates the kind of out in the world things that were traditionally done by men. There's a patriarchal element to this viewpoint too. So the new story offers a different theory of change that says we're not really separate from the other. We're not really separate from the universe. Everything that happens anywhere mirrors something that's happening here. Everything that happens here mirrors something that's happening everywhere else. The inner world and the outer world are connected. Rupert Sheldrake offers a good frame for this, the idea of morphic resonance, or a morphogenetic field. And he says, essentially, the theory says that any change that happens anywhere creates a field of change, or contributes to a field of change that makes the same change happen more easily somewhere else. Which means, as you said, every act has cosmic significance. And I think we have to start trusting that. That's the other reason I was talking about. It's not because, why do you, I don't know, like why do I, plant a garden? Why do I make compost instead of putting it into the landfill, It's not because I think that it's going to make a measurable impact on the landfill. It's more that I have a personal relationship to that compost, and it feels good to do that. It feels, it makes me feel more connected. It makes me feel more alive. So it's kind of another navigating principle than, calculating the ecological footprint of every action and adding up the numbers. Like, is our revolution just a matter of adding up different numbers? We used to add up the financial numbers, now we're going to add up the carbon numbers. Is that a big change? That's not a big change. That's not a deep enough revolution. I think it's going to take us time to come to that realization that we're going to go through a deepening and a deepening and a deepening of the revolution in human beingness. Yeah, another one? No?
I was struck when you were talking, just reflecting on my own life, that these revolutions in my own story are cyclical. And I have, in the first few times it happened, about every 5 or 10 years. And vertigo wasn't in it. It was pure blind panic when I was challenged in that way. And I've now just turned 60. And it gets simpler, is all I want to say.
It gets what?
Simpler.
Simpler.
Yeah. So I'm completely in between. And I guess the question for you is it cyclical in your life?
Yeah, I think we go through a series of initiations into new phases of life. Some, wise cultures had initiations into different stages of life, maybe into elderhood at around your age. Our society doesn't offer these, but the universe is generous and often will provide an initiation that isn't provided by culture. So maybe you're going through an initiation into the role of an elder, whatever that means to you. Yeah. What's that?
Certainly into the unknown.
Into the unknown. Yeah. Right. Well, that's always a part of the initiation. Yeah. It's less scary. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
You predicted a number of, issues or problems in the future, which we all think in a way or feel that will happen. What are your feelings in terms of what's going to happen with people in general? Do you think there's going to be like a massive change to the news story, and how do you see that evolving?
Yeah, I think there could be a massive change really fast in the face of a really deep crisis that first brings us into the state of chaos and unknowing. There's a book by Rebecca Solnit called "A Paradise Built in Hell" that talks about what happens when there's a huge natural disaster in a certain place, like a big earthquake or a hurricane, and the normal structures of society are wiped away. And then people very quickly self-organize and start taking care of each other, and they do a really good job of it. And there's not rioting and looting, and it doesn't turn into a war of all against all. It actually, people start, what I would say is they start living another aspect of their human nature that's suppressed in our society, and that's the aspect of the gift of sharing. if someone has extra food, they make it available to their neighbors. If someone has a cook stove that's working, they bring that out. Like these kind of makeshift kitchens tents arise. After the earthquake, like people start taking care of each other, and then the authorities panic because they're not needed. And then the police come in and they tell people there's a curfew. And so I think that a more beautiful world is just right underneath the surface. And all that has to happen is some kind of breakdown and a scary, chaotic period, perhaps, we have to go through. And we're afraid of that. This is what happened at the conference I was just at. There were several moments where people were really fed up with the structure, which they felt, they were being talked at a lot, I'm not going to go into the whole thing, but there were these moments of chaos, where this revolutionary energy was coming up. And the organizers saw that as, okay, how do we manage this? How do we control this? How do we stop this from happening? So they would say, well, we have to respect the schedule. We have to respect the next process. There are other people waiting, right? And the thing is that the people in the audience went along with it. They were scared of it too. Like they weren't like angry enough or empowered enough to take the power. They didn't know what to do with the power. And we see this happening every time that people take power, they don't know what to do with it. In Egypt, for example, the millions of people in the streets, the police join the protesters, the military refuses to shoot, the people won. But they didn't know what to do with it. So they just installed a new president and went back to being passive. So I think that there has to be more of a breakdown. And at some point we have to say, okay, we're going to go through this passage. We're going to go through this chaos so that new kinds of structures can emerge. It's not about structurelessness, but there's going to have to be experimentation and mistakes, and I don't think there's any other way except to go through this passage of the unknown. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
My question, it kind of carries on. My question's around about fear, and I see quite a lot of activists in this room that are working for social change, and there's just such an atmosphere of fear that stops people from getting involved, or they're so concerned or worried about their own worlds. So my question is really, how do we challenge or hold the fear that people are feeling?
Are you saying that there's fear among the activists, or
no,
that you're trying to reach people?
I wasn't saying that.
Okay.
I was just saying for people who are working and trying to create better systems and way of doing things, where that's one of the biggest challenges, that people are very afraid, and how we help to hold that and in that transition. Yeah, that's my question.
I think it's a good start to recognize that they're in fear, because a lot of what I hear from activists, or I guess from left-leaning people, is that people aren't making the changes because there's something wrong with them, because they're selfish, because they're greedy, because they're ignorant, And I think it's a good start to recognize that they're afraid. So what do you do when you know somebody is afraid to do what they really want and need to do? I don't know, what do you do? Hold them. Yeah, I don't really know myself. I was at the conference. I met a really extraordinary woman who I had a deep connection to. Her name is Jodie Evans. She's the founder of Code Pink, which is a activist organization, and they do like in your face, like direct action kinds of stuff. You know, like she was with I mean, like she'll like, you know, cover her hands in blood, you know, and rush up to Condoleezza Rice, you know, and like wipe her hands on her blouse and say, "This is the blood of the Iraqi children," you know, stuff like that. She camped out on Nancy Pelosi's lawn, you know, and wouldn't leave until, you know, to pressure her to vote against war, you know, like she does like stuff like that. That's really pushing, you know. And so sometimes, so I'm thinking, and this is like not really my style, you know. But if I think back, like when I was afraid to do something, sometimes I needed a push. You know, I needed to be plunged into what I was afraid of. Other times, being like really held in love and patience gave me the opportunity to do what I had been afraid to do. So, okay. Another thing that liberates me from fear is when I see somebody else being brave. You know, and then it's like if they can do it, I can do it. You know, if they can be that generous, and then why can't I? You know, they're not afraid of what'll happen to them if they give away, you know, half their money or give away all their money or do this or do that. You know, like that kind of liberates me as well. So I think that just in general contributing to an atmosphere of fearlessness is really powerful. To be, you know, anything that enables you to be a joyful, unafraid person has an effect, even if it's not a direct political effect. It is infectious. Another friend of mine, this is part of another story, but she was in Nepal, and it sounds like a fairy tale cliche, but she actually like went up to a cave in the mountains and had an audience with a 104-year-old lama, a 104-year-old mystic, you know, meditating in a cave, like for real. And she was allowed to ask him a question. And like, what do you ask? You know, what's the most important thing you could ask? So she said, well, how can I be of service? And bring healing to places that are devastated by violence and ecological and social violence, you know. And he said, well, if there's even one person in that area who has a very deep practice, that will bring healing to that area. And he gave her a second thing too, and usually I talk about the second thing, but the first thing that he said, yeah, if even one person has a deep practice there, and I think one way to interpret that, I mean, you might have kind of a mystical, you know, esoteric interpretation of it, but I have a very practical interpretation of it. You know, someone who has a deep practice will be an infectious agent of joy, of calm, of fearlessness, that, you know, that brings other people into that field. You know, and I think somebody who is fearless and joyful and feels at home in the universe is less susceptible to political fear-mongering, you know, and is less afraid to be engaged and to follow the call of what they care about. Yeah. Maybe one or two more, because I'm getting a little tired.
Hi there. It's just relating to one of the stories you'd said previously about the need for wolves. Obviously, looking back on it, after the deer had decimated the forest, it was looked upon as wolves wasn't, they weren't bad, they weren't evil. Could that maybe be the case with a lot of things happening just now, like you say, the banking system, how it doesn't work, and things like fracking, the kind of terrible right-wing things that I can see in the news? Is that maybe necessary? Or the concept of scarcity, is that necessary to push us into understanding that there is no scarcity?
Okay, let me make sure I understand the question. You're saying, like, are all these terrible things we see in the world, do they have some necessary role to play as well?
It's easy to look at a lot of things and think that's evil and that's
Right.
bad, but retrospectively, like
Right.
the wolf,
Yes.
is it needed?
Okay. Yeah, right. So there's definitely a kind of spiritual teaching that says everything that happens is for a purpose. So cancer might be an example. And maybe some people, after they go through cancer, they realize that was the best gift they've ever received because it brought them to truth. It brought them in touch with what they really care about or whatever. But that gift might only come through our struggle with it. So the gift of, fracking might be that it brings us into engagement, with something that, it makes us, it pulls us into service, and we act to end it. So I think it would be a mistake to say, well, fracking has its role, so I'm not going to really do anything about it. That's actually a way of refusing the gift. So it's really about listening to what calls you. Yeah.
Something that came up in a chat with this lovely gentleman in front of me earlier was an experience that I'm having where I'm experiencing a lot of loss. And normally I'd kind of bumble through it and shrug it off and get on and feel defensive. And because there's been so much happening, I feel a bit overwhelmed by it and stuck. And I'm aware that people feel uncomfortable around it, and I want to ignore it. I want to go back to being how I was before. And so there's a difficulty. And speaking to this gentleman here, I realized there was a sort of liberation in it, that through the inundation of it, I was kind of feeling like maybe I can let go of things a bit more. Maybe this is an opportunity here, rather than to feel sort of just overwhelmed and then just get through it quick. And it made me think quite a lot about loss and grieving and the process that we need to go through to see the new story. And I just wondered if you could talk a bit about loss and grief and how important that is, and how to be with it and how to be with other people when you're in it.
Yeah, I think you kind of said it. It's all these things we're attached to, we'll lose all of them eventually. So personal loss kind of reminds us of that and puts us in touch with what's important. And I think to get that on more than an intellectual level, we have to go through the grief of it, which our society kind of limits, You're supposed to get over it quickly. There's not even a lot of crying at funerals sometimes. So there's loss happening all over the planet, There's there's loss of species and forests and languages and when we don't, well, this is about grief, not loss more. I want to avoid repeating something that I said before, last month, last year, that sounded intelligent at the time, but not running through my formula. So I want to, can you say a little bit more somehow? Yeah, about the loss. Maybe like, specifically, are you talking about the loss of loved ones or the loss of something else?
Mostly loved ones, certain things that I was also used to that were familiar, that was a kind of love. It was sometimes a habit, and through the loss that becomes revealed that I actually didn't like it or enjoy it. It was what I was used to. There's a kind of comfort there. So there's mixed emotions, letting go of the thing that I thought I liked, but actually, what is it moving me on to? The same, something that's similar, or possibly something that's kind of different and new. Mm-hmm. So there's two things. There's loss of loved ones, which is inevitable, and then the other thing, which is ways of doing things that I was kind of attached to. That's come about through those loss of loved ones. Does that?
Yes, I understand.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm just not wanting to state the obvious, but maybe I will. Because it's almost a cliche, but it puts you in touch with what's important. And maybe hints, it hints that other things that you're attached to may not be that important either. So it's kind of liberating in a general sense, yeah?
I was also reflecting on the opportunity that we're continually in a state of flux and change anyway, and we're evolving continually, and to embrace that, not just when I feel the loss, or I'm, that grieving is almost an ongoing part of one's life because change is always happening. So how can I kind of embrace that without it being weighty?
Okay, I got
as well. So I move into the new story as this new evolving person that's alive and present as well.
I have some old friends back in the States. I was friends with them 10 years ago, then they moved away, and I wasn't in touch with them for many years. They have a bunch of children. Their oldest son was just this glorious young man, a martial artist, a musician, so kind to everybody, so intelligent, just like full of light. And he died in a car crash. And I didn't know that until I encountered my friends again, and they told me about it. And it had happened maybe a year before. So they were still, coming out of the grief, but still in it a bit. And the man especially was a transformed person. When I knew him before, he was always angry about, the financial system and the secret world government, and like this conspiracy stuff. He was an angry man. And then when I met him again after his son died, he was like just kind of full of kindness and joy and light, and just really authentic, really like making eye contact, really connecting, and I could tell that everybody who interacted with him would be liberated by his loss, and his realization of how precious every moment is and how precious every person is. That's the reality that it brought him to. If we were in that reality, this world would be very, very different. And so that might be one way to see, the loss as a gift. And I think the same will be true on a species level. We've insulated ourselves as a civilization from the loss. And postponed the grief. But now it's coming to us. It's finding us. That which we have hidden from is finding us. When I was a young boy, I was standing with my father looking at a flock of birds. And I said, "That's a big flock of birds." And he said, "Let me tell you about the passenger pigeons. Their flocks would darken the sky from horizon to horizon for 3 days. People would go hunting by merely pointing a shotgun up in the air and shooting, and the birds would fall down. And today there are no passenger pigeons left." I don't think I'd be doing the work I'm doing today without that story. I really took that in. In South Africa, I met a man talking about all the fish he used to catch when he was a boy, and all those fish are gone, And maybe there was a question before about the internet too, like maybe one thing that's happening, the noosphere, maybe one thing that's happening is that the insulating barriers are starting to break down. On the one hand, the internet distances us. The information technology distances us as never before from the world, because we're in a virtual world where everything is just a pixel. But the extreme of one thing gives birth to its opposite. So information technology, separating us from each other, from materiality itself, now is giving birth to its opposite, to reunion. And bringing those painful things that we had pushed to the margins back to us. I'm not saying that the internet is going to save us, but I think our insulation from the grief is breaking down. The story that says, well, that's just the necessary price of progress is breaking down. The story that says, well, those people are inferior, so their suffering doesn't matter, or they just deserved it. They deserve it because they're lazy or something like that. That all of these are breaking down as the consciousness of interbeing, of oneness, of interconnection. I like to call it interbeing. As that consciousness arises, our knowledge of our connection to nature is part of that consciousness. That we're not separate. Human from nature, me from you. And it's as that veil of separation lifts, all of the naked grief is there. And as we take that in, the veil lifts even more. That's the process we're going through. Thank you. And I think I'm going to end with that, actually. Seems like a good ending. I'm not sure what time it is, but are we somewhat... Yeah. So I really want to thank you for your presence here. And for the work that you're doing, and for the for the individual journey that you're on, every person taking a different path from separation to reunion. And you might sometimes feel that the path you're taking is on behalf of everybody, that the little, like the healing that you're going through is healing the world somehow, making it easier for other people who are in the same circumstance, making it easier for them to heal. So my gratitude toward you is genuine, because I know that to be true. Even the invisible struggles that you can't possibly explain rationally make a difference. What you've healed from. This is truly on behalf of all. And I'm grateful for the necessary journey of every single one of us here. This is not a revolution in which some people are important and some are not, in which some people's work is making a difference and some isn't. That would only make sense if we were indeed separate individuals in a world of other. But this is a revolution in which everybody is along for the ride, not because I think it's a virtue to be inclusive, but because it's just true. So thank you.